In October 1835, Brunel was attending a meeting of the Great Western Railway directors in London. The conversation turned to the length of the proposed main line from London to Bristol. It is said that Brunel responded to some concerns by saying, "Why not make it longer? Why not have a ship go from Bristol all the way to New York?" Although the story sounds made up, it is believed to be true, and the origin of the Great Western Steamship Company. As a result of this, Brunel turned his considerable inventiveness to ship design. At that time, sailing ships still dominated the world's oceans and would continue to have a significant presence for some time to come. One only has to think of the tea clippers like the Cutty Sark here, which was launched in 1869. Steam-powered ships had been around since the beginning of the century, well, boats really. The Comet was the first steamship to operate a commercial ferry service on the River Clyde in 1812. Even Brunel's own father, Mark Brunel, had launched his own steamship, the Regent, which ran a ferry service between London and Margate. Steam power was not deemed suitable for longer distances because the received wisdom of the time was that no ship would ever be able to carry enough fuel to power non-stop steaming, for example, when crossing the Atlantic. The few steamships around tended to be hybrids, which most of the time used sail power and only fired up their steam engines when there was no wind. At that time, the transatlantic trade was dominated by what were known as passenger or packet ships, which were sailing ships, and tended to be about 180 feet long, that's about 55 meters, and weighed up to 1,000 tons. Things were developing at a steady pace, but when Brunel's entry into the world of shipbuilding was bound to be disruptive. Comparisons have been made between Brunel and people like Steve Jobs and Elon Musk in the present era. Disruptive people like these often go back to first principles, and this puts them in a minority. Most people look at limitations and assume that the established wisdom or established truth, call it what you will, is correct because lots of people have looked into this issue and they can't all be wrong. Disruptive people don't make such assumptions. It had been assumed that steamships were only viable for short runs because the only way to increase the quantity of fuel that could be carried was to increase the size of the ship, which was measured as water displacement. So a small ship could not carry enough fuel because it was small, certainly could not carry enough fuel to do a crossing under steam, for example across the Atlantic. At the same time, a bigger ship would consume much more fuel, so still would be unable to cross the Atlantic under steam. Brunel realized that this was a fallacy. The energy needed to drive a ship through the sea doesn't depend on the vessel's weight, but on the resistance to the water it's being pushed against. In other words, the surface area of the hull. This meant that a 2,000-ton ship doesn't have twice the surface area of a 1,000-ton ship, and therefore doesn't have twice the resistance. To put it simply, the bigger the ship, the better the energy to surface area ratio is. So one way to enable ships to cross the Atlantic under steam all the way was to make the ships as big as possible. In 1836, enough investors had been found to form a company and work started on the new ship in Bristol. The keel of the ship was 205 feet long, over 62 meters, at the time the longest in the world. The ship was to be called the Great Western. What a surprise. Despite its length, the ship was to be made of wood, but the steam engine and the paddle wheels would be fitted in London. Brunel's contribution was the overall conception and the design of the two engines that would power the paddle wheels. Quite how he found time to do this isn't clear. He was in the middle of building the world's longest railway from London to Bristol, working on the Clifton Suspension Bridge, and a host of other projects. The final ship was 236 feet long, that's 72 meters, with 2,300 tons displacement. A beast. On completion, the Great Western was sailed to London and the engines and the paddle wheels fitted. However, by now, competitors in London and Liverpool had realised that Brunel was onto something. They rapidly started converting existing ships into steamers to compete. A company in London chartered a little steamer called the Sirius, which was only 703 tons. In March, while the Great Western was still testing her engines, Sirius set off for New York. Meanwhile, while doing the engine tests, there was a fire on the Great Western. It was quickly put out in the emergency, but Brunel was injured while trying to help. Quay was quite badly injured, but it didn't stop him working. The Great Western set off on the 7th of April, almost 2 weeks behind the Sirius. Despite being so far behind, and the bad weather, the Great Western made the crossing in 17 days and arrived in New York only 1 day behind Sirius. It still had 200 tons of coal left in her bunkers. A success, a sensation. The Great Western did the journey back in only 14 days compared to the 18 days for the Sirius. The success of the Great Western was a game changer, and the future seemed assured. Over the next 8 years, the Great Western made 67 fast Atlantic crossings. They immediately started planning a bigger, better, faster, and much more innovative ship. At first they thought of just a bigger version of the Great Western, but in 1838 they had turned to the idea of an iron ship instead of using paddles, they would use a propeller. Why iron? There were limits to how big a wooden ship could be. Wood is a rather bendy material. Larger ships needed more bracing, and that meant a lot more wood, which was not only expensive, but it took away valuable cargo space. The iron needed in a ship also weighed only about 70% of the wood needed in a wooden vessel of a similar size. There had also been developments in producing wrought or worked iron, which brought down the price significantly, in particular the invention of the puddling furnace, which made iron stronger and a lot cheaper. Why a propeller? Brunel believed that the propeller would be more efficient because it was totally submerged. This was confirmed by observations of the Archimedes, the first working propeller-driven ship. He designed a 16-foot propeller, nearly 5 meters, that you can see here. It is so efficient that even modern propellers have only improved efficiency by 5%. The next ship they built, the SS Great Britain, was a very different beast from the Great Western in many ways. The hull was more streamlined and made of iron. It was much bigger, with a displacement of 3,675 tons compared to the 2,300 tons of the Great Western. It was the new biggest ship in the world with the biggest engines. She is arguably the single most important vessel in terms of ship design history, and by far the most advanced ship to date. In August 1845, she made her first Atlantic crossing in 14 days, a triumph of engineering. However, Brunel's dream of a service that ran from Paddington in London to Bristol and then on to New York wasn't realised. The Bristol port authorities were so slow in updating their port for bigger ships, and this meant that these ships had to operate from the rival port of Liverpool and consequently couldn't use the Great Western Railway. The construction of Brunel's third ship has generated controversy among historians and is often being blamed for causing his death. It was by far bigger than his previous ships, and it was way ahead of its time in many respects. It must be remembered that this was Brunel's idea. No one had asked him to build the world's biggest ship. It all started when the Australian Mail Steam Company consulted him about the idea of a ship that would only need reloading with coal once on the way to Australia. This was the era before empires like the British Empire had coaling stations dotted all over the globe. Brunel produced a specification for ships with a displacement of between 5,000 and 6,000 tons. The Australian Mail Steam Company thought this was far too ambitious and went on to order smaller ships from others. But Brunel started thinking about how big a ship would be needed to carry its own fuel for a journey to the Far East, and even a ship to carry its fuel there and back again. His crazy, creative mind got to work and he envisaged a ship that would be 6 times larger than the SS Great Britain, which had been the biggest ship in the world at the time when it had been launched. One thing led to another, and the Eastern Steam Navigation Company was founded. Work started on the ship on the Isle of Dogs in London in 1854 and was completed in 1858. The construction was mired with problems related to the financing, and even launching the ship off the slipway into the Thames took many attempts. There were also several accidents. The Great Eastern was massive for its or any other time. It held the title of the largest ship in the world for nearly 40 years. It was approximately 692 feet, 211 metres in length, with a displacement of around 32,000 tonnes. It had a double-hulled design which made it wider than most other ships of its era. The ship was powered by both steam engines and sails. It had 6 steam engines that could generate a combined 8,000 horsepower. The steam engines powered both a propeller and 2 paddle wheels on either side. This made the ship extremely manoeuvrable, which would stand it in good stead later. However, it was too big and too expensive to compete in this market. Some regarded it as an unlucky ship from the beginning. This reputation for being unlucky started at the launch into the River Thames from the shipyard. Such was the weight of the ship that it took several attempts over 2 months to get the ship into the river. At that point, the ship needed to be fitted out. During this period, Brunel was under massive strain. Most important contractor went bankrupt before the launch, and the work was delayed due to financial problems during the fitting out period. Added to this were the technical challenges of building a ship that was new in almost every way. In 1858, Brunel's doctors told him that if he didn't take a break, he wouldn't survive the year. He spent the rest of the year in the Mediterranean, especially in Italy, where he had done some work as well. On his return, the ship was ready for its maiden voyage. Brunel missed the celebratory banquet on board the Great Eastern because he was too ill to attend. He can be seen here some days later on the 2nd of September, visiting the ship before its maiden voyage. A couple of hours later, he collapsed on board and was taken home. He is believed to have suffered a stroke. On the 7th of September, the Great Eastern headed down the River Thames for its maiden voyage. Meanwhile, Brunel was waiting for news from his sickbed. On the 8th of September, the ship was shaken by a large explosion and 5 stokers were killed, several more being seriously injured. The ship was not seriously damaged, but the loss of life was tragic and seemed to confirm this opinion that it was an unlucky ship. Brunel was told about the accident on the 10th of September. By this time he was very sick and he died on the 15th of September. The primary intended use of the Great Eastern was for large-scale passenger and cargo transport between England and Australia, as well as other long-distance routes. But it was too big for this market, too far ahead of its time. It later found a purpose laying long-distance telegraph cables, starting with the transatlantic cable in 1866. The Great Eastern was particularly good at this because of its enormous storage space and fantastic manoeuvrability, because of the fact that it had both propellers and paddle wheels. After a career as a cable layer, it became difficult to find a use for it, and it was scrapped towards the end of the century. Unfortunately, even the company that scrapped the Great Eastern made very little money. Only one of these 3 historical ships has survived and is with us today. Ships are expensive to maintain when they are not making money, and they are also full of expensive materials like iron, which makes them very valuable for scrap. As you may have realised from the photographs, it is only the SS Great Britain that has survived to this day, and even the rescue of that ship was really touch and go. For decades, the hulk of the SS Great Britain had been beached in the Falkland Islands, where it was used as a kind of storage facility for things like wood and coal. In 1970, a decision was made to salvage the SS Great Britain and return it to the United Kingdom for restoration. The salvage operation was a major undertaking which involved first refloating the ship. The decision was made to bring the SS Great Britain back to its place of origin, Bristol. Bristol was where the ship had been originally built, and it was decided that the ship's restoration should take place there in the dry dock. The SS Great Britain was transported across the Atlantic on a kind of large barge and arrived back in Bristol in late 1970. It was placed in dry dock known as the Great Western Dock, which is part of the original dockyard where the ship had been built. Once in Bristol, an extensive restoration work on the SS Great Britain began. This included repairing and refurbishing the ship's iron hull, restoring the interior to its 1843 appearance, and ensuring its long-term preservation. The restored SS Great Britain was open to the public as a museum ship in 1970, and it's a great place in which to understand what life on board this ship was like in the 1840s. I visited the SS Great Britain and walked on its decks and got a feel what it must have been like. If you ever find yourself in Bristol, I strongly recommend that you visit it. As we have seen in this series, Brunel achieved an incredible amount in his 53 years. There's just one more surprising thing to talk about, which I'll cover in the next and last episode. Bye for now.